Buddy, thank you so much for joining us today. This is our fourth conversation like this. It's been really fun. Today, man, what a privilege to have Dr. Soong-Chan Rah with us, my friend. And actually, if you were on one of these calls before, Soong-Chan's friends with Drew Hyung, and we had Drew on a couple weeks ago. We talked about emotional health. And so there's some connection there. But those of you that maybe you're logging on for the first time, my name is Brad also, if you haven't met me before. And I'm going to moderate this conversation. And it's awesome. I mean, these have been really good. This is our fourth one. And we've just gotten great feedback, great opportunity to ask questions and kind of dialogue about things. Just so everyone's familiar with the format, I'm going to ask some questions and we're going to dialogue. We're going to kind of follow where the conversation goes. At the bottom of your screen, there's a little chat box there. And if you have questions while we're going, pop those questions in there. And then Missy will be sending those to me separately, kind of curating which ones. A lot of times what's happened, we've noticed some of those questions get answered as we move through the conversation. And then there's some that just really are insightful that we got to come back and circle back to. And so we hit those. So that's kind of the way it goes, and we're just going to dive in. So Soong-Chan, thank you so much, man. Really appreciate you being here and joining us.
Thank you. Good to be on with you.
Yeah. Just kind of some context. We know each other through a really random thing. And actually, what's really funny is I was thinking about this morning. So we climbed Kilimanjaro together, which is an amazing thing. In fact, I remember when I found out that you were going on the trip. I was just like, I was ecstatic. In fact, I think my friend Gabe's on the call right here. And I remember calling him and telling him, and I was like, man, Soong-Chan's going on this trip. We're going to climb Kili together. It's going to be this amazing thing. And it really was.
Yes.
And Anna, your daughter, came with us.
That's right.
A student at Pepperdine and brilliant. We had so much fun. And
yeah.
Her and I talked The Bachelor because I've got 3 girls that seem to watch The Bachelor as well. Sorry, you guys can forgive me later for that. But yeah, we had a great time. But as I was driving this morning and I was thinking about, and I think the most powerful thing we did together is we're in Rwanda for several days together, and we went to the genocide museum there. Man, that was insane.
Yeah.
That was, when I think about the two of us standing there after that, I think the heaviness of the moment was huge. I just think the context and everything that was going on, it was so insane. But so we've had some journey together. A lot of the people on the call right now, a big chunk of people are church planters, and they started churches, which you have been a part of. You want to give us just a little brief snapshot of your history with that?
Sure. Well, Brad, I was just thinking fondly back to our time together. It was about 10 months ago now that we were in Kilimanjaro. And so that bonds you. If any of you have done anything like that, when you're spending 7 days climbing a mountain, and then another 7 days after that, visiting the great work of World Vision in Rwanda, but also, the tragedy and the tragic history in Rwanda. So glad to be with you, Brad, and glad to be a part of this. Just a little bit of background on I've been in the academy, I guess, or teaching at a seminary in the academic world for the last 15 years. I've been teaching at North Park Theological Seminary. And that's given me the opportunity to write and to do some of the academic work that I hope is helpful for the church. But prior to that, for about 17 years, I was a pastor and served in ministry so about half of my career has been in ministry. The other half has been in the academic world. So I'm one of those people that try to integrate the two together, to do the good academic work and to do the study that I think is essential for some of the work that we do. But also I've wanted to have kind of my feet on the ground and do the work of ministry. So I was a church planter. I've actually been involved with 4 different church plants. And I like to say I've run the spectrum of them. The first church plant I was a part of was in the Washington, D.C. area, and I was actually a member of the church plant, not the lead pastor, just kind of fresh out of college. Actually, I was 22 years old and was part of this church plant that just started off in the D.C. area. It was 2 services, actually, a Korean congregation and an English-speaking congregation. Korean congregation ministered more to the immigrant congregation, and the English congregation was more broadly Pan-Asian, but also multi-ethnic. So that was my first church plant. The second one, which I probably what I've know the best would be the 10 years that I spent planting and being the senior pastor of a church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I
Yeah.
was a church planter there for 10 years. And out of that church, we also planted 2 more churches. It's also good if you're a church planter to have on your resume at least one failed church plant, because that makes it real. That's authentic. If you have a failed church plant, then you are really a church planter. And so, of the 4 churches that I've been able to participate in, one of them was a failed church plant. It lasted for about 6 months to a year, and realized it was not gaining traction. It was a high complex church plant. We're trying to do not just cross-cultural, but cross-socioeconomic, to an at-risk group, mostly kind of at-risk Southeast Asian youth. And it was just a very difficult thing to pull off. So that's my background in church planting. And like I said, kind of half of my career has been in ministry and the other half has been in the academic world, but I'm hoping that the two kind of come together.
Yeah, man. Thanks for validating those of us that have failed at church planting. I've got one of those on my resume too. So it's good. I mean, it's always good for us to know there's risk, and some of the reward is looking back on the failure. That's for sure. I think one of the things, and I have some specific memories of our time together in climbing Kilimanjaro. There was one day where you and I kind of solo walked for
That's right.
hours together, and we had just some amazing dialogue. And I think one of the things I've always appreciated about you is just your ability to, you can get at 35,000 feet really quickly, and you can look at culture, and you have a way of just seeing what's happening in culture. You're not just saying, okay, here's kind of what we're seeing, but you actually see it through some specific lenses as you kind of look out the landscape right now. And this, I mean, obviously the COVID thing is bringing some things to the surface, but even in general, these days, I mean, as you kind of look and have your finger on the pulse of culture, what are you seeing? What are you observing?
Yeah, so in my both my ministry experience and in my academic work, I've looked at things like cultural change and social change. So my role at North Park is the evangelism professor. And I looked at evangelism, not simply learning the how-tos of evangelism. To be honest, that's easy to teach, 4 spiritual laws and, ask 2 or 3 questions. That part you can do in 15 seconds, teach the mechanics of evangelism. I think for me, a big part of it is learning the narrative and framework of evangelism. And that has a lot to do with getting beyond the surface of the how-tos. And so one of the things for me in evangelism is actually, how do we think about changing structure, systems, changing the world in such a way that the gospel can take root? So if we use the illustration of the scripture about where seed lands, right now we're in very, very rocky soil. And so part of it is not making sure that we have the right seed at this point, because I think most of us in the churches have figured out what the seed needs to look like, but what the soil looks like. And that's where I think for me in evangelism, it's trying to understand, and church planting, for example, how do we understand the soil into which we are planting our seed? And that is a cultural, social analysis that is very, very necessary. So one of the things I've looked at are kind of 3 different ways that the world is changed, or society is changed, or how culture is influenced. The first 2 are probably common to most knowledge, but the first is the one that most, for lack of a better phrase, evangelicals, American Protestant Christians, tend to look at, which is individual change. If you want to change the world, change the culture, change the individual. That's been the dominant narrative around social change the individual, change the world. The second thread has been, well, you can't just change the individual, you have to change the system. Systems and structures also have to be confronted. Now, for me, as I've looked at it, both through a biblical theological lens and through a social reality lens, you've got to have both. You can't just say, we're going to deal with it just by individuals or deal with it just by systems. You've got to do both and. So I'll use the example of race, for example. I think we have to address individual prejudice, and we have to address individuals that have prejudices and racist attitudes. So that is an important part of what the church can do, change individual attitudes towards race. But we also have social, structural, systemic problems that we have to address as well. That, COVID being an example, right now in Chicago, where I am, 70 to 75% of the deaths have been among African Americans.
Wow.
In a population that is about 30% African American. Now, that to me reveals a structural problem. because of some of the underlying conditions that predisposes African Americans to die of this is lack of access to healthcare, diabetes and hypertension because of that lack of access, food deserts where food is not available, so there is higher rates of diabetes and hypertension. I've had 2 students who've died of COVID. They were students in Stateville Prison. So we're seeing that there are individual reasons why these things happen, and there's an individual responsibility, but there are also some profound structural problems that have led to this. So you've got to do both and. But there's a third element that I've been looking at in terms of how society changes, and that's narratives. Worldview, narratives, our imagination, as my mentor Willie Jennings has talked about. And that's a little tougher to suss out. It's a little tougher to figure out, because, to say, all right, we're going to have a Sunday school class that's make sure that the individuals in my church do not hold prejudices. Great, that's wonderful.
Right.
Or we're going to sign petitions so that some prisoners who are in there unjustly won't die in prison because of racial injustice. That's a systemic challenge.
Mm-hmm.
But when you talk about what are the embedded narratives that are so deeply embedded that even if you change individuals or change the system, the narratives keep playing itself out. That's been my concern in more recent years of how does society change? Change individuals? Absolutely. Change systems and structures? Absolutely. But maybe that third element of how do you change a community's imagination? How do you change a community's worldview or narratives that are so deeply embedded that they operate out of these narratives even without thinking through what they're doing? So that part to me has been kind of a new frontier, I think, for me, of how to examine social change.
Okay, man. So I'm like already looking at the clock because I just want to like go into this. Okay, so how do we change the narrative? Give me a specific example.
Yeah. So, I mean, think about the narrative or the narrative / assumption imagination that one people group is superior to another people group, right? And we could see systems that rose up out of that assumption. Slavery rose up out of the assumption that whites had a superior mind, intellect, culture, and therefore could take Africans into slavery. That narrative shaped that system. Jim Crow laws clearly would be an example of that. The new Jim Crow laws would clearly be, mass incarceration would clearly be an example of that. We see that in COVID right now, where certain bodies are more expendable, right? So, the rate of contagiousness around Latinos and Asians is one of the highest in Manhattan and New York right now, because they're usually the immigrant communities that are working the high jobs that are the highest risk. Navajo Nation is one of the most highly infected. So these dysfunctional, broken systems oftentimes emerge out of broken, dysfunctional narratives that fuel these systems. So one of the things that we can do is actually create counter narratives that battle the existing narratives. So here's an example of, you can't fix a broken narrative or imagination with more of the same narrative or imagination. So the example I often use is 25 years ago, I'm sitting at a Chili's. I was a seminary student, and a group of us are there for 50-cent fajita night. And as we're enjoying our 50-cent fajitas, a news flash comes on the news, the 6 o'clock news. And it's Magic Johnson. And Magic Johnson announces that he is HIV positive and that he has AIDS. Now, most of us remember that moment. I remember it very clearly. And the first thought that came into most of our minds when we found out that Magic Johnson was HIV positive is that he's going to die. 3 months, 6 months tops, Magic Johnson is going to die. Last we checked, Magic has lived quite a long time and still alive, flourishing, very healthy, very wealthy. He's lived a very full life with an HIV/AIDS diagnosis. But we've had so many efforts to fix the problem of HIV/AIDS, haven't we? The most significant one I can think of is the RED campaign.
Right.
The goal was to raise money to help those with AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. And there was a study done on this. They spent $10 million in advertising revenue to try to raise money for the RED campaign. after 10 years and $10 million spent, how much money was raised? $10 million. So how much did they net during those 10 years to try to combat AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah.
Zero.
Nothing.
Nothing. Why? Because they were trying to fix a problem with the same narrative that created the problem in the first place. So what's the problem with AIDS in Africa? This is somewhat controversial. We have a cure. It's not a cure in the conventional sense, but we have a way of someone who has an HIV diagnosis, like a Magic Johnson, to live 25, 30 years of their life. So it's not like we can't stop this dread disease from killing off people right away. We have some kind of medical intervention to allow them to live a long life. The problem is that the greed and materialism of the corporations that want to charge someone in sub-Saharan Africa the same amount they're charging Magic Johnson's insurance company. So if the problem of AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa is greed, you can't fix that with more greed. And so the Red Campaign's goal was fix the AIDS pandemic by buying a red t-shirt from Target, by buying a red iPod. And like I said, $10 million spent, $10 million earned, zero revenue. Who made the millions during that time? Target and Apple and Levi's made the billions during that time.
Right.
So you can't fix an existing problem or a narrative that's broken with more of the same narrative. You need counter narratives. So if the narrative is one of brokenness along the racial lines, or narrative is one of assumption of superiority of one race over against the other, the church creates a counter narrative that demonstrates the opposite value system. Not the same value system of materialism, of individualism, but a new value system that shows the world, actually the church is different. We're doing things differently.
I just need like 5 minutes to let everything you just said sink in for a second. Because I mean, immediately I just look across the landscape of church and I think about all the ways we basically are, it's like self-help with a Jesus twist is a phrase I like to use. It's like we're just sort of taking these same things that are happening in culture and we're just tagging Jesus to it and then sort of hoping the church grows in it. And fundamentally, we're not actually changing the narrative. I mean, I think that's one of the things we observe is it's, you know, come to Jesus and have all your wildest dreams come true. It's like, you know, I kind of hear the Sears slogan in the background of, you know, it's a good life at a great price, and the great price is the cross, but it's your good life. Now you can have your white picket fence and your perfect life. And we've just turned the whole thing around.
Right.
So I'm also thinking about things that you've also, I sense that it's not just creating a positive narrative, but it's also calling out the narrative that's there. Talk a little bit about your journey towards that. Cause I mean, I get the sense from you that the conversation, and a lot of you on the call, probably maybe one of the reasons you're listening is that Soong-Chan's, you know, my opinion, one of the best people to speak on the subject of race in the world. And I appreciate. Also, let me say this, he's made me mad and he knows that. There was actually a conference, I'll tell this story really briefly. There was a conference he spoke at a couple of years ago. And the beginning of it, I'm like, yes, you know, because I want to be the white woke guy. And so I'm like cheering him on. And I'm not kidding. By the end of the session, I was literally just fuming. I was so mad. And we talked about this when we were in Africa. And I mean, afterward, I was hanging out with a bunch of non-white buddies and I was just telling them my frustration. I was like, you know, basically Soong-Chan's just challenging me to use my voice. And then he's telling me to shut up. And then he's telling me to use my voice. And then he's telling me to shut up. And then finally I said, I don't know if I'm supposed to talk or not talk. I don't know when I'm supposed to speak or not speak. And a guy named Robert Guerrero, a good friend of mine, looked at me and he goes, all right, bro. He goes, now you know how I've been living all my life. So I say that to say, Soong-Chan, you have permission to push my buttons in my life. In fact, when I first read the Next Evangelicalism, I leaned into it because you started by saying, if you're white and reading this, get ready. Tell me about your journey towards the race conversation, because I know it didn't start this way. It started, you're a church planter, you know, you're not headed that direction. Where did this become a significant part of the dialogue for you?
Yeah, thanks, Brad, and thanks for the permission to keep poking at you. That's actually, yeah, you all heard it. I'm allowed to poke at him and get him and
Yeah.
upset him. So that's on this call. So my background is, I'm a Korean immigrant. I grew up in Korea. Actually, interesting background for me is that I'm fourth generation Southern Baptist on my father's side. My father's grandfather was one of the first converts to Baptist, but when the Southern Baptist missionaries first came to the U.S. To Korea, sorry,
Wow.
and was one of the founders of the First Baptist Church in Pyongyang, which is now the capital of North Korea. But at that time was actually one Korea. And then my father actually was one of the group that fled from North Korea, moved to South, and so my heritage goes back 4 generations in terms of the Baptist Christian tradition. My mom actually comes from the Buddhist side of the family, is the Buddhist side of the family, but she becomes a Christian later in life in Seoul. And so that's kind of my background. But when we moved to the U.S., we weren't coming as people with non-Christian background. Our family was very steeped in Christian faith and coming from a very church background, and again, multi-generation in terms of the church. Um, but my parents ended up splitting when I was about 7, 8 years old, and what that meant is a pretty precipitous drop in our family's income, and so we ended up moving to a poor neighborhood. I say rough neighborhood in Baltimore, but if you've ever been to Baltimore, that's redundant. Every neighborhood in Baltimore is rough. But I grew up in a rough neighborhood in Baltimore. And what I remember about that neighborhood is that we were about a third Black, a third white, and a third recent immigrants, mostly Korean, but immigrants. And all of us had poverty in common. We were all poor. We were all on food stamps. We were all in assisted housing, subsidized housing. We were all in the same school as well. But even though we had poverty and marginalization and disenfranchisement in common, we didn't get along. So in elementary school, we mostly got along. We would hang out together, and I had friends across the different cultures and races. But then in junior high school, we started kind of separating out a little bit more, and we would have our own lunch tables, and we would sit with our particular ethnic group and hang out with them after school. And by high school, they were full-blown gangs that differentiated along racial lines. So that experience growing up in an inner city neighborhood where I felt, look, we've got poverty in common. Why is it so impossible for us to actually get along when we have that commonality?
Yeah.
So that's been a big part of my journey to say, can the gospel, can the church, can the presence of his Holy Spirit in the midst of our people, can that actually produce a unity that I did not see growing up? And the sad part is it's yes and no. There are some places where Christianity and our faith produces an incredible, wonderful unity across the dividing walls of hostility. And in other places, faith actually creates more of a barrier between different people groups. So that's kind of been my background in this. And I've tried to live that out when I was in college. I went to college in New York City, and being in a very diverse environment, both in the neighborhood that I was in. My college bordered Harlem and Spanish Harlem. It was kind of flanked on two sides by those two neighborhoods. At the same time, it's a very wealthy, affluent Ivy League school with mostly Asian, white, Jewish was kind of the main three ethnic populations in that school. And trying to figure all of that out of like, why is it that we still can't get along, even though we're in these kind of communal contexts that should allow us to have conversations together. And that's been kind of my journey along the way. And that's why I wanted to, back in 1996, planted the multi-ethnic church, intentionally multi-ethnic. And back then, we were maybe the second intentional multi-ethnic church in all of Boston. Now there's more, and thankfully there's more. But back in 96, most churches were still operating under the homogeneous unit principle. But a lot of that comes from my upbringing and growing up and seeing this division, these dividing walls of hostility, and really wanting to see our faith, our Christian faith, the gospel, actually make a difference in that kind of reality.
Yeah, man. I have so many questions right now. One of them, I'm just going to throw this out there and just say,
Sure.
would you give us, if you were going to give us a narrative, use your imagination to describe the church accomplishing what you just gave us? Can you give us a picture, give us a snapshot of what that what do you imagine being the reversal of the current narrative being?
Yeah, so I'll give you a story, and maybe this will kind of spark an imagination because this is a true story. As I mentioned earlier, I've lost two students to COVID-19. There were two students at Stateville. I've been teaching for the last 3 years a class at Stateville Correctional Center. In Chicago right now, the two places that have been hit the hardest with the highest rate of infection and highest rate of death, one is Cook County Prison, where people are awaiting trial and they can't afford bail. So there's a move to let's get them out because you're putting them in a situation that is completely impossible.
Yeah.
And the courts are closed on top of that. And the second place that's been hit hardest is Stateville, which is where I teach, or we had to suspend the class, obviously.
Mm.
But that experience has really been a changing of the narrative for me. And I experienced firsthand what it means to experience this kind of paradigm shift changing of the narrative. And the background story is, look, I have 2 master's degrees in theology and I have 2 doctorate degrees in theology. I'm a full tenured professor, job security. I've written multiple books. So when I'm walking into a class at Stateville Prison, I'm the one coming with every privilege imaginable, right? I mean, full prof, all my degrees. I'm coming in with every privilege as the expert, as the person who's got everything to teach, as the, kind of the quintessential, expert leader in that classroom. And to be honest, my first class I taught there, that's the way I operated. I came in with all the answers. Here's the syllabus. Here's the books you're going to read. They're all my books. You have to read all my books. So that was kind of the approach that I took with this class. The truth was, this is about 3 years ago, was that I was going through a very difficult time personally in my life, just kind of challenges with family, with career, just a lot of different things were happening, and it was happening all at once. So about maybe 7 or 8 weeks into the course, the facade of strength, the facade of perfection, the facade of I know everything, I just couldn't keep it up anymore.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know if I recommend doing this, but I kind of broke down in front of my class, and it's kind of strange. I'm the shortest in that class, short Asian, mostly African-American men,
Yeah.
and they're all, what they do in prison is they read half their time is reading and the other half is working out. These men are buff and cut, and, this is a max prison. So they're in there for 15 plus years for various crimes. And I just broke down in front of that class, and I couldn't put on that facade of strength and perfection anymore. And I remember very clearly, it was a brother named Corzell Cole. And Corzell, you kind of imagine what a South Side Chicago person in prison would look like. Yeah. Corzell, 6'4", 220 pounds, cut, tattoos, gold teeth. I mean, and he was a gangbanger from the South Side. Yeah. And he comes over to me and he whispers in my ear, I'm going to get in trouble for this. And then he hugs me, and then he holds me until I just kind of stop breaking down. And in that moment, I'm not the expert with all the answers, and the Asian with all the degrees, and the African American who is in jail for whatever knows crime. We are 2 human beings made in the image of God, and I'm receiving the gift of grace from this individual who, frankly, society has thrown away. And that changes the narrative. It changes what we think about who is the expert, who is the leader, who has the spiritual authority. And those are the examples I think we need to see. One of the other students the next week, I don't know how he found out, but he learned how to say, brother, I love you in Korean, and said that to me. Another student, he's an older gentleman, he's in his 60s. He was on death row until his sentence was commuted to life in prison, and he's been in prison for 30, 40 years now. 2 weeks later, he handed me a painting and said, I thought of you while I was painting this. And apparently he thinks I'm a black man with an afro, because it was an African-American man with an afro charging the gates of hell.
Well, by the way, those of us that know you, we know that there is quite a bit of African American in you. So
I'll send this group. I'll send you, Brad, a picture. I have a photo of it. It's in my office, but I have a photo of the painting, and it is an African American man charging the gates of hell. And he said, "You're doing this, and this is what I'm praying for you." So again, the narrative changes. It's not me, the person with the degrees and the tenured professor coming in. It's Corzell, the South Side, gangster. It's William Jones, formerly on death row, and they're my pastors at that moment. They're my teachers. When I tell that story, I'm trying to change the narrative of what incarceration looks like. what theological education looks like. So
Mm.
I think those are the places that shake up the imagination of this is not the status quo. There are different ways that we can approach theological education, different ways that we can approach what, again, prison ministry looks like.
Yeah, it's interesting, that as you're talking about that, I think one of my challenges, and I think, this is, and my heart is to really lean in. And at the same time, I think there's that practical side of, I also lead a church and I've got responsibility and staff, and we've got to pull things off. And, there's always these very tactical questions around, there's sort of the philosophical, yes, I want to be this person, but then tactically I have to make decisions every day. And I think sometimes, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's this sense of, man, just tell me what to do.
Yeah.
So that I don't, and especially as a white guy, I don't want to mess this up. I mean, that's an honest thing. And I've got a couple of friends on here that have heard me lament my whiteness. I just like, man, I want to do this right. And at the same time, I guess what I hear you saying is, if you want to journey down this road, it isn't about tactical decisions. It's literally about the posture of your heart, the posture of your thinking.
Yeah. And formation. How are you formed in your spirit and in your soul? That's a huge factor, I think. One of the professors I had at Duke was Sam Wells, and he wrote a wonderful book called Improvisation. And the idea of that is that in improv, in theater or in some kind of like comedy troupe, you inhabit a character, and so what you improvise feels natural because that it's speaking out of that character, right? So if you know that character well enough, or if you know the motivation of that character or the thought process of that character, when you improvise, that's what you end up, riffing on. And so that actually, I think if you look at it from kind of the larger theological, spiritual formation lens, how you are formed and what you are steeped in is when these crisis moments come, that's what you will speak out of. If there's a depth there, if there is a spiritual depth there, and we're seeing it, to be blunt about it, that's what we're seeing right now in our society. People who have a depth, they're speaking out of that depth. People who don't have that depth, they're speaking out of their what.
Right.
So what you're seeing is, that kind of depth is what we want to cultivate. And for me, in terms of race and cross-cultural, it has really meant doing a deep dive and leaning in, like you're saying, Brad, into other communities. And one of the best ways for me, as I've mentioned in other contexts, is just being at the feet and learning and being discipled by and mentored by different people of different race than me. So you're going to have him on in a couple of weeks. Willie Jennings was a very important mentor of mine. He was my doctoral advisor. Jay Carter was one of my teachers at Duke. Emmanuel Katongole, Valerie Cooper. These folks shaped who I am as a scholar. Eldon Villafane, Humberto Alfaro, Latino scholars who shaped who I am. But in the Native community, for me, that's been just a place of incredible growth and learning. Mark Charles, my co-author, and the late Richard Twist, and his influence on me. Actually, Richard's from the Oregon area, or lived in Oregon, Washington State area for a while. But these are individuals that profoundly shaped who I am. And so when I operate, now, and I react, I'm not reacting I'm reacting out of a positive formation that I've had. So when I say I want to operate out of an understanding of the Black church, that comes from having studied with Willie Jennings, the Black church, but also some of the most important mentors in my life in ministry have been African-American pastors. So Ray and Gloria Hammond, who are just incredible pastors in Boston, they're some of the most incredible people I've known, African-American pastor of a AME church. Because of my time spent with them, because they formed me and shaped me as a pastor, when I react out of something, I'm reacting out of that depth. And so I think that's one of it's practical. It just takes a long time to develop. And it actually takes some trials to develop to get to the point where you are formed in such a way that you're actually operating out of that depth rather than out of something else.
You just hit something. It's really interesting. But, as a kid, the two Sunday school teachers that I had in junior high and then high school that made the biggest difference were African-American men, a guy named Marvin Knight and a guy named Egypt McKee. And as you're saying that, I'm just realizing, oh man, that's probably so significant. Maybe explains part of why I am is because those are my guys who poured into me, were They weren't white dudes. They were, in fact,
Yeah.
the white Sunday school teachers, I didn't want those guys. They were boring. White Baptists are not as fun as black Baptists, that's for sure. But then it's also, it's fascinating because like I one of my daughters, one time we were sitting talking, she was pretty young, but she said, "Dad, is there such a thing as reverse racism?" And I was like, "Yeah, but I don't know where we're going here." So I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, my friends were talking today and someone asked the question, if there was a black man on one side of the street and a white man on the other side of the street, which side of the street would you feel more comfortable walking on?" And her friend said the white side of the street. And she said, "Dad, I don't know why, but I felt like I would be safe if I was on the black side of the street." And she just shared that with me. And we realized later that I just was thinking about that. And I realized that every black man in her life has been like a father or an uncle to her.
Wow.
And she's seen more horrible stuff from the white culture than she has black culture. And so for her, man, it's so helpful because I'm just sitting here right now and thinking, I've got Willie Jennings' commentary on Acts. I've got Amos Young's commentary on Acts sitting around me, and how much that stuff begins to shape, which then, oh man, I'm just so excited right now. But then the idea of empire and diaspora that you see in non-white commentaries and how they see the book of Acts, and how they see all that stuff just starts to sort of pour out of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're describing is the tricky part for me. And, I do enough of these interviews that I get this question a lot. And the question I get is, do you not like white people? And I have to kind of I have a set answer to say, no, I love white people. Some of my best friends are white. Ask Brad Williams. He's a white friend that I have. No, I don't do that. But
I'm your white friend.
But those kind of questions do come up. For me, it's not like, do I like white people? But there have been systemic structural issues that showed, and I don't even need to use the word white at that point. I can say there's a dominant culture. There's a dominant way of operating. There's a dominant community, and that has operated in such a way that certain things have happened to those who are not in that dominant culture. So, the labels to me aren't as important as the reality of people have been harmed by the dominant system. So if that is the dominant narrative that is at play, the alternative narrative of that is a yielding of that power by having non-white mentors. It doesn't mean, for me, I've never had a shortage of white mentors. I've always had white pastors, white supervisors over me. My deans and my faculty, above me have almost always have been white. So that's never been missing in my equation. But I've sought the other side of it because it takes a little more intentionality. So, I'm not the kind of person to say throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I appreciate Calvin and Luther. I appreciate Augustine, although Augustine was African. I appreciate the icons of Western theology. I want to learn that, and a lot of my education is rooted in that. But I have to make an extra effort to go and find the Willie Jennings of the world, and to go and find, the James Cones of the world and the Gustavo Gutierrez's of the world. Because when I went to seminary, 25 years ago, they were never on any of the reading lists.
Right.
So it's not, do I hate a certain group, or do I, have a bias against? No, it's that I've already gotten that part of my education. That was handed to me in my MDiv at Gordon Conwell. I read Augustine, and we loved Jonathan Edwards. And I still do. I think they have a lot to offer. But I had to make an extra effort to read some of these other authors. And so by saying I want to concentrate on these authors now, I'm not saying I'm rejecting these others. I'm saying most of my education has been in this area. I'm just kind of bringing the swing pendulum back in the other direction for a little bit.
So, I'm just linear and I get really practical. So, I think number one, what we're hearing you say is a posture of humility is sort of the starting place of, I'm not the expert. I have much to learn. Yeah. Secondly, be mentored by people that are not your dominant group. So seek mentoring from somebody else. What would you add to that? What other things would you say?
Yeah, that's a great summary. Excellent summary. I'll do another illustration, which is a good friend of mine who, a white couple, lives in the south side of Chicago. They planted a church in a mostly multi-ethnic community. They were doing a cross-cultural adoption. They were adopting an African-American child. And so they had to go to a training session. And so the training session involved the couples that were adopting around the table, a glass bowl, and then many, many different multicolored marbles in the middle. And they went through a series of questions like, what are the typical TV shows you watch? Who's on the cover of the magazines on your coffee table? What kind of art do you have on display? What kind of furniture do you have on display? And to correspond the color of the marble to the culture out of which, these things correspond. So the last 10 books you read, the last 5 pieces of music you played on the radio, that kind of stuff. And so again, my friend, he's a very woke white guy, lives in the South Side. He said after about 20 of these questions, this jar was filled with white marbles. And then the final question is, take the color of the child you're about to adopt and put them in the middle of that bowl. And so you have this one black marble with 20, 30 white marbles surrounding it. I would say that is probably what passes for multi-ethnicity in many of our churches. And so that third thing would be the mentorship, the humility, but also what have you surrounded yourself with? What's the type of culture? What's the input that you have? And, would a person feel comfortable walking into that? So, you think about, okay, who are the last 5 families you've had over for dinner? And if that is not outside of your ethnic group, then, what would that look like to start diversifying? I would actually even go further. What are the last 5 homes you've been over for dinner? That's a kind of a different thing as well. Inviting people is one thing, but to be invited into another person's home, that's a whole different ball game. What are the TV shows that you watch? What's the music that you listen to? What's the art you have around the house? Those are all things that you have surrounded yourself with. Again, the formation of what have you been formed by. A really good question I like to ask is the last 10 books that you've read, and what is the race and color of the authors that you've read? If it's all 10 white marbles, then you probably need to vary your reading list a little bit. So again, it goes back to what have you surrounded yourself with, and how deep are you willing to go so that you are engaging these other voices in your life. And that does require humility as well, but it's also an intentionality to say, I want other input in my life, and just kind of everyday things, not just like a mentor you meet with once a month, but really an intentionality around every day there's going to be kind of a different input that I'm receiving.
Yeah, man, that is so good. It's really interesting because here I live in a place, I looked up the statistics, Beaverton, Oregon is 64% white. Portland, Oregon is 80% white. I'm on the border of the two, so I'm going to guess I'm 75% white. And, here I'm in this space where, me, you know what my heart is. And when you say, can we create a space where a person of color could walk in and feel comfortable? And I think, I got a friend that recently just opened up to me. He moved here from Atlanta, African-American VP at a corporation nearby. And he said it took him 2 years to get comfortable coming on a Sunday, and man, that's such a weird tension there. That's such a hard thing to live in a white place and say, there are a lot of white marbles around here,
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say, because I think most here are pastors or preachers, is demonstrate that it is happening in your life. So I think one of the most poignant and significant moments in the church back in Cambridge when I was pastor is both our kids were dedicated by African-American pastors. Ray and Gloria dedicated Anna, and Bill and Paulia, Mooney McCoy dedicated Elijah. And I think that demonstrated to our congregation, your pastor has these relationships, and it's not just, some random people that he trusts his children to these individuals, to this couple. That I think goes a long way. And some of the stories that I would tell in my sermons would be, because Ray and Gloria, especially Ray, was doing a lot of work with at-risk youth. And I would say the other day, Ray and I were driving around the back of a police car, and we were visiting, at-risk youth who were, African-American kids who were in danger of flunking out of school or in danger of getting kicked out of school. And when you tell those kinds of stories, you're broadening the world of maybe the kind of the whites that are in your audience, but also kind of affirming that narrative with, so when my congregation saw that my relationship with African-American pastor was not, I'm training them or I'm teaching them, but I'm their student. They're my pastors. That demonstration of that was probably one of a lot more than the 100 sermons that I preached on that topic. That demonstration, that visible demonstration. So again, what does that look like in the artwork you have around your buildings, in the hymns that you sing, the choices that you make, even dropping some lines here and there to say, hey, you know what, today is such and such a day in American history. And it's not that well known, but it's worth talking about. I'm surprised that the churches in St. Louis don't know about some of the history of St. Louis. That it was in St. Louis that there was a federal court case. I'm blanking on the name of this now. That actually deemed African Americans as less than human. And that happened in St. Louis. And so the white church in St. Louis should have been preaching on this to say, we need to remember this, that in our city, it was declared in the federal courts that blacks were inferior to whites. And I wonder if that had been kind of commemorated and become a part of the culture of the white churches in St. Louis, if what happened with Michael Brown might have been different too. Right. Where some of the conversations that had to happen after the fact, if it had happened before, and if some of the congregations had already been having these conversations around, well, St. Louis has been a Missouri Compromise. These cases that came through the St. Louis court system, there's a spirituality there we can discuss. And so some of that, if that had been done ahead of time, might have actually changed some of the conversations later.
You just did a great, one of the questions that came in was, how do you go about changing the narrative around race when so many in the white American church have such strong knee-jerk reaction to even bringing up the subject? I think what you just detailed is such a good way to do that, and I think I've tried both. I've tried the front-on collision, and I've tried to model. The modeling's tough, because I think sometimes, and I've watched this. I've watched white pastors participate in tokenism.
Yeah.
It's like they got a quota. Well, we got this, and at the same. So there's that balance always for me. We have conversations just really transparently right now. We have conversations about who's on our stage. Mm-hmm. And do we just have a bunch of white people on our stage every single week after week, or are we actually thinking about what it's like? And I think some people can view that as, oh, you're just being token, or it's, no, I'm actually thinking about the Latino couple that's going to come in, and they're wondering, is there going to be anybody here that looks like us today?
That's right.
And just those small things. Here's a question I've been wanting to ask you for a while. You use the term intercultural a lot, versus multicultural versus multi-ethnic.
Yeah.
Help us understand your perspective on that and why.
Sure. I'm going to use my definitions. There's also a sociological definition that Corey Edwards at Ohio State, brilliant scholar. She uses these slightly differently, but I'll give you the way that I use it. They line up fairly well, but both of us distinguish between the term multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural. And many times those are used interchangeably. And I don't think that's correct, because, for example, the racial categories are oftentimes the kind of the census categories, right? You have Black, you have white, you have Latino, Latina, and then Asian, Pacific Islander, and Native. So these are kind of these large buckets of racial categories. Now, to be blunt, many of these are artificial, right? There is no, the Latina race is multiple races, if you want to use the correct term for it, because you have almost every race in the Latinx community. You have, an African Brazilian would be considered Latino, along with like a European Argentinian would be kind of in the same Latina space. And so some of these are relatively artificial. But what that tends to do is we tend to look at that from the lens of color, or from the lens of visual optics. And to say, oh, if we have 20% white, 20% Black, 20% Latino, brown, 20% red, 20%, you go down the line, now we've got a multiracial church. And that's not bad, but I would like us to go a little deeper in, which would be like multi-ethnic, which is actually more of the biblical term. And that ethnicity can be kind of broken up in more so into like nationalities or even people groups. And so for me, I consider myself racially Asian, but ethnically I'm Korean. And so, that's actually a pretty important distinction between being Asian and being Korean. You could say that about whites as well. I'm white, but I'm of Scottish descent. I'm of of Russian descent. Those are different. Italian descent. Those are very different. And so those it has kind of a different language around it. So I know of a single racial church that is extremely multi-ethnic. It's a Spanish-speaking congregation in Boston that has 14 different nationalities. Now they're from Colombia, they're from Panama, they're from Dominican Republic, from Puerto Rico, Mexico, all different nationalities, but they're together as one racial category. But the cultural differences between them are very, very high. Then you get to that kind of other level of cultural differences. So even as I identify as a Korean, ethnically, nationally, even within the Korean culture, you're going to find nuances of Korean culture. So there's a difference between myself, who's more of a second generation. I was born in Korea, but 45 years of my life I've been in the US. Culturally, I'm going to be different from someone who just came from Korea, who just came, who's an international student, very different culture. So even though we're ethnically Korean, racially Asian, we are going to have very different cultures. So I tend to like the term multi-ethnic because sometimes it includes both, but I tend to think that when we use multicultural, you get a little more kind of a broad spectrum of understanding of how complex this issue is. And then I'll add to that the idea of intercultural. Yeah. Because the idea of multicultural sometimes means, some of the negative ways we've seen this is the melting pot, which means you take all these multicultures and you melt them down and make them disappear. You make cream of mushroom soup by melting everybody down. I don't want to end up like that. I don't want to end up in a blender and have my culture blended away. So intercultural would be more like, no, let's actually have these flavors not blended into one blob, but actually have these flavors stand out. The other example that I use is the salad bowl, where you have all these different vegetables. But my complaint is you usually drench that with creamy ranch. And
wait, why'd you choose? You chose a white dressing. Come on.
I chose the most bland dressing I could think of.
You could have chosen Thousand Island. It's not as white, but no, you chose.
Thousand Island at least has a little kick to it, but creamy ranch is just bland. So my joke is, you have kimchi, which is one of the most flavorful, pungent dishes you're going to get. You douse that with creamy ranch, it still tastes like creamy ranch.
Right.
So that's not what we're looking for either. That's some church models of multi-ethnicity. Everybody looks different, but everybody tastes the same. Right. So I think about like multi-course meals. We used to do these things in my old church called progressive dinners, where you have, an appetizer in one home, and it's unique to that home. And then you go and you have a second course in another home, and then a third course in another home. And each place you're experiencing not just the food, but the culture of that home. And you're getting different, unique flavors. You're not blending them all together. So maybe that's another example. So that's more intercultural. You're not just kind of blending them together or dousing them. You're actually trying to get the unique flavor of each. You're saying, don't check your culture at the door, bring your culture in. And part of the gift of this community is that we can actually be intercultural, not just kind of blend it all away or, cover it with something else, but actually in your unique culture and in my unique culture, we can have some interchange or interconnection that actually deepens rather than kind of dissipates the cultural context that we're in.
It's so good. Here at our church, we translate, the services are in 5 languages on any given Sunday. And so, but at the same time, I mean, as you can imagine, in Portland, Oregon, there's a lot of white people in the room, and this navigating this and saying, okay, we're going to have 5 different languages being preached on a Sunday, and then trying to create that solid instead of just some sort of homogenous culture is such a challenge. Because there's coming out of the Korean church, there's always there's always the EM. You got your EM, then you got your Korean service, and it's always been this thing. Well, you just kind of spin it off, and that idea of integration and at the same time celebration. Yeah. It's that, and it's constant work, man. It's just like it never. Sometimes I get tired. It's just like, you just, and then that's where I got to stay in this. You got to stay put forward.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be blunt. The easiest thing for me right now, and I haven't been a local church pastor in a long time, but easiest thing for me would be go back to a Korean American church and pastor. Now, obviously pastoring is not easy, but I wouldn't have to deal with the wide range of cultures that I would have to deal with in a multicultural, intercultural church. So, I know that culture. Right. So, for example, if I go back to a Korean church, I would not have to explain my name every time. So I get that all the time. Why do you have this funny sounding name? Why didn't you ever get an American name?
Why
People
can't we just call you
mispronouncing.
Soon? Yeah, all those things, right?
Yeah. So I'm like, well, that would not happen in a Korean church because
Yeah.
culture is less of an issue in your ethnic group because everybody knows the same culture and operates out of that. But that's why it's both a blessing and a challenge to be in these intercultural, multicultural environments, because you're always having to learn and to adapt. And let's be honest, ministry is hard enough, but to add that extra layer of complexity, man, I don't know if some of us, we need to be ready for that because it is more complicated.
This obviously I'm teaching through the book of Acts right now, reading Willie Jennings. This week, I just am overwhelmed with, and this is what I'm preaching. Part of my message on Sunday is the radical inclusive nature at Pentecost.
Yes.
I mean, the most defining statement is that people speak of God's wonders in languages that everybody could hear. And
Yes.
it is this multi-ethnic, multicultural, intercultural moment.
Yes.
And how we get past, but the observation for me is it required the Spirit of God to make that happen. Like
Amen.
in our flesh, we're not going to get there. When I have those moments when I'm just confronting this, it's like leaning in and saying, Lord, like lead me into this and help me not to back off. Because the easiest thing for a white guy is, man, I can be in the conversation for a little bit, but it's easy for me to go underground because I can go back to the Korean, like you going back, I can go back and just sort of ignore it. And then 9 months later, I pop my head up again and go, oh, here I am again. Let's have that conversation some more.
Yeah.
And instead just saying, no, I've got to constantly stay there, stay in that space, pressing forward is so critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Man, I'm checking our time and I'm so like, there's so many things we could talk about. A couple of people have asked questions about resources, and what we'll do is we'll put these up on our website as well at Foursquare Multiply. But real quick, Soong-Chan, a couple of authors, non-white people we should be reading. You mentioned J. Cameron Carter, who I love his stuff. Who else would you recommend? Willie Jennings?
Willie Jennings, Christian Imagination, the Acts commentary is incredible. Christian Imagination was his first book that actually kind of started it. Jay's work on race, the theological account, very dense, very, very complex to kind of walk through. But if you want to take a look at that, I would also recommend Emmanuel Katongale's work. I really appreciate Ann Jo, Joh, and her work on kind of a Korean feminist reading of Christology, Heart of Christ. She goes into some of the Han theology that I think is really informing about Christology. So that's another book I tend to recommend as well. And of course, the last book that I wrote, the very recent book, is by Mark Charles and I. Mark is a Native American Navajo activist and pastor. There you go. And that book is, in fact, if those of you are interested, I'm going to be doing, Mark and I are going to be doing, I think it's through Kilns College, if you look up on their website, and if you check my Facebook page, the two of us are going to do like a book discussion on unsettling truths. So look for that. If you, again, follow me on Facebook, you can probably find some of the information. We're going to start posting that soon. I think May 18th or something is when we're going to start. But you can enroll in that, and Mark and I will lead conversations about that book. So that's, I think, helpful because it offers a Native American perspective on things sometimes we don't really get.
Yeah, it's really meaningful. I grew up in Arizona, and I started my ministry on the Navajo reservation. Wow. And so this book has been really powerful. So you guys, this one also, you told me about this one in a food tent. We were sitting eating dinner on a mountain. I think we were like 10,000, 11, 13,000 feet. And you started telling me about this book. Quick premise of it. Give us a little thumbnail sketch of, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. You want to unpack that in 2 minutes or less?
Yeah. So, the main idea is that there is an imagination, a narrative or worldview that is embedded into American society. And a lot of that actually comes from some dysfunctional theology. And one of the most dysfunctional is the doctrine of discovery, which was a series of pronouncements by the Catholic Church that essentially declared European bodies as superior to every other body. And it actually gave permission for the Europeans to conquer Africa and take them as slaves, conquer the New World, and kind of do the genocide of natives. And we trace how that kind of imagination, called the doctrine of discovery, has actually been still evident throughout church history. Up until 2005, the Supreme Court was citing the doctrine of discovery as the reason for taking land away from natives. So we try to trace that whole history through Abraham Lincoln, through Manifest Destiny, through the Declaration of Independence, Constitution. So I think it tries to do a historical take, but from more of a Native American Christian perspective.
Yeah.
So, and some of you might know Mark Charles is running for president as an independent candidate. So if you want to check out some of his work, you can check it on his website. But I think the book is probably the good theological summary of what Mark is trying to talk about.
Yeah, it's, man, yeah, I love it. You know, I think you made the comment to me, you can't discover a land that people are already living in. And is the moment that you have that wake up moment, you go, oh, and think about everything we've been brainwashed to believe about this nation and how that is just leaks into, I mean, that's our family of origin in some sense, and that it leaks its way out. So really great book. Also, I mean, the next Evangelicalism, if you haven't read that, I think everybody on the planet should read the next Evangelicalism. So it's really, really, really significant. That's huge. I love Amos Young, by the way. I mentioned him too. Amos is great. And for those of you that are Foursquare on this, he's also recently a Foursquare licensed minister as well. So he's and the dean at the theology dean at Fuller Seminary. So he's infiltrating that Presbyterian world there. So love what he's doing. Man, so there's a couple more questions, but we're out of time. So many good things. Bro, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Very good to be on.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. Those of you that are paying attention, we mentioned Willie Jennings a couple times. Gabe Barrero, district supervisor for Foursquare, is here. And next week, he's going to be interviewing Dr. Willie Jennings. And there's information on the North Pacific District website for that. You can guess, like, it's going to be really good. I mean, he's amazing. He actually preached a historic sermon at Fuller called "Can White Men Be Saved?" And that's a really good question. So, but Soong-Chan, thank you, my friend. And I will talk to you soon. You guys, thanks for taking time to be with us today. We'll post the recording of this. We might even have Soong-Chan just give us a couple extra tidbits to post or something, and we'll share those things with you. So thank you so much, everyone. All right. See ya.